Government laws and the laws of supply and demand are what shape and form economies. And this lecture is going to introduce that concept, talk about some both theoretical and real world events. So let's get to it. One of the first government policies we're going to look at is price control. So we've got our little government official there, and what we have is Brian, who comes running in. Remember, he's the owner of a restaurant, and he says, hey, I don't think potatoes should be more than $2 a pound. And this is called a price ceiling, meaning is that we shouldn't allow potatoes to go higher than that. That's the ceiling of the price. Well, you know the farmer's not going to be happy about that. He comes running in to lobby, and he says, no, 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 no. Potatoes should not be less than $4 a pound. And basically, we call this a price floor. Now, the good old government official has got to decide if either one of these arguments are really worthy of being considered, or if we should just let the free market decide on the price. So our little government guy, being a good guy, he does some research and he finds that this is the current market for potatoes in the city. And now he starts to think about this and he says, well, I want to look at the buyer's viewpoint here. If I was to set, let's say, a ceiling that he couldn't buy it for any more than $4, which would be sort of the floor of what the farmer wanted, how would that affect us? Well, we'd put a straight line in here because basically we're saying is that nobody would buy potatoes for less than $4. So basically there's sort of a cutoff point at here. Now, this is probably pretty good because we consider this not binding because right now the equilibrium price is below the binding price. So there's still plenty of room to move up and down. So $4 is okay as far as the ceiling is concerned because Brian would still be able to buy potatoes for less than $4. But what if he does what Brian asked, which is to set a price ceiling at $2? And so we'd still have our line drawn in here, but we have a much different scenario now. Now what we have is a problem is that basically our equilibrium point is above our ceiling. And that means that where people are willing to consume and where people are willing to supply are two different points. So now what we've got is that we've got a supply of only 75 because basically the farmer says, I'm not supplying more than 75 pounds, but Brian wants to buy 125 pounds. So that means that we now have a shortage. We have a shortage because we're not in equilibrium. We're not in equilibrium because basically the price has been artificially put down. So what we have is a binding constriction. So when we have a binding constriction, we tend to have shortages. Let's look at a real life basically of a price ceiling and the results of that. And this is the U.S. gas shortage of 1970. So in 1973, you could buy a gallon of gas for 50 cents. But by May of 1974, so that's less than a year, gas was over $4 a gallon. Now, this created gas lines, as you can see. And, gas shortages became very common. I can remember my brother's job was to get up sometimes at 3 a.m. in the morning to get in line to get gas from my mom so that she could go to work because we couldn't get gas. Now, we also began to discover that the demand for gas and the supply for gas, well, they were just not there. Demand and supply were out of whack. And so much so that President Nixon at one point asked gas station owners to stop selling on Saturday night and all day Sunday. Even if they had gas, they weren't to sell it. That was to try to keep more gas coming in and more going forward because the thought was is you could stay home on Sunday anyway, and it was to try to basically do what a lot of people were trying to do, conserve energy. And we had other energy conservation started, such as reducing the highway speed down to 55. You could only get gas sometimes on certain days if you had an even or odd tag. NASCAR even reduced the length of its races and discontinued some races because of the outcry of people saying, look how much gas they're wasting and all these people need gas. But probably among the worst of the things was basically the vandalism that began to occur. It was not uncommon in many neighborhoods where if you parked your car outside, because maybe you didn't have a garage, that people would come along and siphon out your gas. And so you'd wake up in the morning and where you thought you had some gas in the morning, you had no gas. Or you'd go to work. And when you come out from work, they would have siphoned your gas out. Now, one of the interesting occurrences from this was this demand now for locking gas caps. And if you've ever seen an old car, now 1970 car, and you see a locking gas cap, this is why they had locking gas caps, was to keep people from getting to their gasoline. So how does this occur? Well, let's sort of theoretically work this out. Before all of this happens, we have an equilibrium point with price and quantity. But some things happen in the world. That's a whole nother lecture. And the result is that OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which was the main producer of oil at that time, decides to reduce production. Now, when they reduce the production of oil, that rises the cost of oil per barrel. And oil is needed to produce gas. So we know that when input prices go up, production and supply enough, well, companies are going to stop supplying so much. And that's what begins to happen in the U.S. market. Basically, with those prices going up, we saw that companies weren't willing to supply as much. Now, this would have been okay because eventually we would have come to a new equilibrium price based on that sort of situation. But we have an artificial thing that begins to occur. President Nixon comes in, and this is now in 1971, so it's a little bit before this happens, and he decides that he has to do something to control inflation. So he puts in basically some price ceilings, and he does this on many economies, but two basic commodities, and oil and gasoline were two of them. Now, this was only supposed to be 90 days, but if you notice, this is continued by Ford and by President Carter. It's not until Reagan comes in does this price ceiling go away. Well, the price ceiling basically is a real problem because here we have a binding price. And as we learn, binding prices can really affect the marketplace. If the price of gas had stayed under the binding price, we would have been okay. It would have not binding. But you can see that the equilibrium point is above. So the new equilibrium point is above. So what does that mean? Well, that means is that what people are willing to supply versus what the demand is, they're two different amounts. And so basically what we're going to have is a shortage because we're not within equilibrium. This is a great example of where a price ceiling really affects supply. Now, we learned from this experience, and because we had this when we had Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita, basically sort of back to back, we had a lot of disturbance in the oil supply. Basically, domestically, we lost a sixth of our domestic production. And even more importantly, on top of that, about a third of our international oil that would come in got basically pushed back because the ports were destroyed. So we had a real problem with oil supply right after that. But we had learned about price ceilings, and because we didn't put a price ceiling in, what we did have is sort of a new equilibrium point that came in. And yes, we had a few shortages here and there. And yes, prices went up a little bit, but we didn't have the tremendous lines. We didn't have the vandalism. We didn't have the energy conservations that we had in place before. And very quickly, things began to establish and sort of settle out because prices had gotten expensive for gasoline. So all kinds of new people had come in to say, I'll supply gasoline. New companies came over to do that. So what we found was not having a price ceiling tended to make us come out better. And we learned that lesson because of the U.S. gas shortage of 1970. This is another reason why it's really important for you to understand not only economics, but the history of these things so that we know when we should repeat certain things because it worked and maybe when we shouldn't repeat certain things because they didn't work. And we came out of Katrina and Rita and the problem with oil supply there much differently because we had learned from the gas shortage of the 1970s. We'll look at another real world event, and that's rent control policies. Now, you'll notice I say short and long run here. One of the things we did talk about in another lecture was that a time span makes a difference quite often in how we see something play out. So we have some seniors, we have an area where we'd like to put in some rent control because we want to make sure that people can stay in their houses. Maybe prices are going up around them a little bit or just inflation is there. In the short run, basically, we're going to see a small shortage because we do have basically this rent control price that's in there. You can't charge more than that. But one of the things you may have noticed is that both the demand and the supply are inelastic. Now, supply is perfectly inelastic. Why? Because in the short run, landlords can't build a lot of apartments all of a sudden. They can't suddenly have a lot of new places to rent out. So it tends to be that they can't make quick adjustments when it comes to something like rent. And for demand, basically what we're talking about is that people don't move as much as you tend to think. Not when you talk about larger scales of people. And part of the rent control is to help people stay where they're at. So if it's inelastic, a change in price has this very small change in demand. So we're going to have a small shortage, but not much. But over time, things change. In fact, maybe a stadium has come in near this area. Now we've got a whole new area that's being developed. And so now we're talking about a longer run. In the longer run, notice that there's a big difference that occurs here. Now our supply is no longer inelastic. In fact, both of our supply and our demand are now elastic. And what we're basically kind of showing here is that in the long run, the supply can increase. If I see a reason to build more things, then I'm going to go ahead and build more things. Also, we have to kind of think about the fact that demand may increase because there's more desire to live in the area, but also because the rents are low. And with lower rents, as rents go up, those rent control places become much more desirable, you might want to say. So with elasticity, we say the price change will basically create more demand. So how does a landlord respond? Well, there's several ways a landlord could respond. One is they could basically rationalize housing. Some keep very long waiting lists, so it's almost impossible to get in. Others prefer to perhaps list for tenants without children or without dogs. They make it difficult to get in there. Unfortunately, people discriminate based on race, national origin, even religion. And some apartments, basically, they stop taking care of. They say, why bother? I'm not going to make enough money. So we begin to see this large shortage begin to occur. Remember, people respond to incentives. That we talked about when we talked about the 10 principles of economics. And in a free market, landlords are trying to keep their buildings clean and safe because it becomes more desirable and thus command a higher price. But if I can't command that higher price, then there's no reason, no incentive for me to do that. So here's a good example of sort of how a short run versus a long run with certain policies can affect the economic balance within a city. So this next example is something that's argued over all the time, and that's minimum wage. Now, unlike the other ones we've just talked about, minimum wage is actually a price floor. Why? Because it's the lowest price that can be paid for labor in this case, but it's the lowest price that can be paid. Now, this is not an argument that's new. It's been argued since 1938 when minimum wage first came out. What is interesting is that, at least as far as minimum wage is concerned, we have a federal minimum wage, and we can also have state minimum wages, but state and city minimum wages cannot be lower than federal. You can be higher, but you can't be lower than federal minimum wage. So let's take a look at how this basically applies. So here's basically what our equilibrium employment and equilibrium wage location is. And then if we put in a minimum wage, we've put in basically a price floor. And this is our binding price. So we now know that basically anything underneath the binding price is okay. Anything above is not good. So if we put in this binding price right here, what we've got is basically a labor surplus. So we're not in equilibrium because remember, we can't charge less than. So we're talking about coming down this time, not going up. So if we can't pay less than this, we have this labor surplus. And what does a labor surplus do? Well, basically, there's the quantity demanded. Here's our quantity supplied. We have unemployment. So what we have to do is say that we need to look at whether or not having a minimum wage, and if the minimum wage is really helpful. Because for higher skilled people and experienced people, they're not really affected by minimum wage policies. It doesn't change their wages at all. However, it does raise the wage of people who are low employed, basically people who are at current minimum wage. As the income rises, though, for these people, then they're have more money to spend, and supposedly economies rise at the same time. Because if they're only making enough money to basically pay their bills, and maybe not even make enough to pay the bills because of inflation, then they're not really adding to the economy. And in fact, they may even go off of jobs, because why bother to work if I can't make enough money to basically pay my bills? I'll go on other substances that would help me pay my bills better. So if we raise the income, we do find that some economies raise. The problem is that it only works for a very low number of workers. And it doesn't work for people who are unemployed or underemployed. It's only for those who are really right at that edge. Now, the greatest impact happens to be on teenagers. And you might not think much about it, but a 10% increase in the minimum wage tends to show a 1 to 3% increase in unemployment in teenagers. And also what we find is that a raise in wages tends to create a higher dropout rate in some areas of the United States. What we're finding is that people who are not anticipating going to college, people who are anticipating going into minimum wage jobs, know that as the minimum wage goes up, there's going to be less and less jobs. And so they're jumping out of high school early to grab the few jobs there are, because they know that jobs may go away. And so instead of getting more educated, which might help them in the long run, it's actually increasing in some areas, again, of the United States, people to withdraw from school. Now, I keep saying within some areas because, again, labor is one of those things where we have many different markets, and each market acts very differently. So if we're talking about a middle income area, then you're probably not going to see the same results as far as the impact on teenagers as you might find in an area where there's low wages in the first place, or low educational levels in the first place. So this is going to play out differently from city to city. But what we do know is that the long-term and the short-term effects of this policy, they're really debatable. In fact, economists really don't agree on it at all. I mean, if you take formal surveys, and I could quote a couple of them, basically it's split down into thirds. There's going to be a third who say we absolutely should increase minimum wage just because overall it will help the economy. Then you're going to see a third who says, no, we shouldn't increase middle wages because it lowers how many people in the middle class. And then you probably got about a third who say, I don't know. It all depends. And so that's one reason why we may be seeing better success with state and city minimum wages than we tend to see with federal minimum wages. So a city like San Francisco, which is very expensive to live in, then a minimum wage may work better there because of the economic costs in the first place of that particular location. And the economic costs are high because we have such a high level of educated people there who are working in things like Silicon Valley. Well, if you have a lot of people who are making a lot of money working in Silicon Valley, you still need a labor force that can service this group. You still need people who are going to make your coffee. You still need people who are going to do your dry cleaning. And these wages tend to be lower. But if they're so low that they can't afford to live in the city, then you're going to lose a whole workforce. So there's a situation where perhaps a higher minimum wage within that city helps equate what that city needs in order to run, but that same wage may not work out in the middle of Oklahoma or in the middle of Utah, where there aren't a lot of workers, where there isn't a lot of high wage jobs, and overall living economies are much lower, basically the cost of rent and everything else. So a great example of basically a price floor, but also another great example of how we can't always take one basic policy and apply it always uniformly across an entire economy. Let's talk about another big area of government policies and laws, and that is taxes. So we got our nice little government guy here, and he sends out basically an email that says they're going to start imposing a 50-cent tax on every pound of potatoes. Well, as you can imagine, our buyer and our seller aren't too happy about that. So, of course, the seller comes yelling in saying the buyer should pay the tax, and the buyer says, no, the seller should pay the tax. And now what the government official really has to do is begin to understand what the tax burden is going to be and how is this tax burden going to be divided between the buyer and the sellers. So let's take an examination of how that actually occurs. Let's look at the seller first. Now, we already know the market for potatoes. We've seen this before. At $3, our seller can sell 100 pounds of potatoes. But there are three questions that we need to ask. We need to know if this tax is going to affect the supply or demand and how it will affect the shift. And then at the end, how does that shift affect the equilibrium? Now, the truth is that we know this one is going to affect the seller because we've already said we're going to place it on the seller. So how does this affect basically the curve? Well, the taxes are going to raise his production costs. And the important thing to understand is that it's going to raise at every level. It won't matter if he's selling 1 pound of potatoes or he's selling 1,000 pounds of potatoes. It's going to affect at every point. As such, we're going to see basically an upward shift or a left shift in the supply he's willing to do by 50 cents. Now, this means that there's going to be a new equilibrium point between demand and supply. And so at that new equilibrium point, we have some new prices. He's basically going to be able to sell at $3.30, but he's only going to be able to sell 90 pounds. Now, at first, this may sound good because he's going to make more money, but he's not really making more money. What you have to remember is that while he may be selling at $3.30, he has to take 50 cents of that out because that's the government's money. So he's really making $2.80 a pound, which is less than what he made before. Well, since that didn't work out too well for him, maybe it would work out better if we put the tax burden on the buyer, but we'd have the same three questions. Now, again, we already know in this case it's going to be the demand curve because the buyer is always the demand curve, but we're again going to see that we're going to have probably a 50-cent shift. Why? Because the buyer may decide that paying 50 cents for the potatoes may not be worth it. So he's going to demand less. He may find other products that he wants to use instead. So we have this downward shift in how many potatoes Brian's going to buy. And again, we're going to see that since there's going to be less purchased, we're going to have a new equilibrium point. And interestingly, this equilibrium point is going to say is that $2.80, he's willing to buy 90 pounds of potatoes. Now, is he really only paying $2.80? Is it good for him? No, not really. He's going to wind up paying $3.30 because while the seller is selling at $2.80, we have to add that 50 cents. So he's really buying it at $3.30. Taking a look at the effect of the taxes on both, we can boil it down to this. The seller in this case is going to earn 20 cents less per pound and is going to sell less pounds compared to the original market before there were taxes. And the buyer, well, they're going to wind up paying 30 cents more per pound and they're going to buy less potatoes basically. So it doesn't really matter what's interesting. If the levy is on the seller or on the buyer, they both are going to share the burden of the taxes. So the only real difference is who's going to pay the government. If it's the seller, they're obligated to do it at the time of sale. If it's the buyer, they're obligated to pay for it when they purchase the product. Now, overall, we have to remember that buyers and sellers are going to share the burden of taxes, but that taxes do discourage market activity. Now, in some cases, we might want to do that. So the price of cigarettes and the taxes on that is to discourage the purchasing of cigarettes. But in other cases, we might want to take away taxes to encourage market activity. Let's talk about a sort of a real world concept of burden of taxes, and that's the FICA tax. If you're an employee here in the United States, you pay FICA. And FICA is basically a government policy to help pay for Social Security and Medicare. Now, when this was set up, the argument was that the burden of the tax should be shared equally, 50-50 between the employer and the employee. And let's see if that actually plays out in the real world. Now, in theory, this is how it should basically play out. And if we were talking about all the United States, sort of in a macro, we would see something similar to this. We would have basically our quantity demanded by our employers. Now, the employers in this case are the buyers. They are buying the labor. The workers are the producers. So you have to sometimes get that in your head to make this work correct. But basically, the employers are the buyers, and they're willing to buy this much quantity, and you're willing to supply at this wage. Now, notice it says no tax wage, because the no tax wage is sort of a theoretical wage, because for most of us, we're going to be paying FICA. And so we don't have a no tax wage. But of course, the law says that it should be basically a 50-50 tax. So we take our little bracket and we take our no tax wage and we say here are basically the points of wages that each group is going to pay. And what we find, if we put our lines out there, is what the workers receive versus what the firms pay. Now, that whole area is basically the tax revenue. So what we are supposed to see, according to the law, is that when you get your paycheck, and let's say you've paid $200 in FICA, what you do not see is that the firm has also paid $200 in FICA. The total tax revenue is $400. You paid half, they paid half. And if things are working out like they should, we should see this 50-50%. Now, that little triangle, they call this dead weight loss. That's for a whole nother lecture, but because I know some people see that terminology, I wanted to just throw it in there so you know what it was. Nothing for us to be concerned about right now. I do want to take a quick conversation on this one, because sometimes people don't understand why the sort of dots are so much higher. Why would the firm be higher than the no tax wage? Well, that's because anything that the firm pays for you to be employed is considered to be part of your wages. So FICA is considered to be part of your wages. If you get any of your health care paid by your employer, even 10% of it, that's part of your no tax. That's part of your wages. If you get a car or you get other benefits, that's part of your wages. All of that goes on the books for your wages. So your wages, according to the employer, may be much higher than what you actually get in your paycheck. So that's another reason why we have different amounts compared to what the no tax wage is. Now, if this is going along and everything is great, then wonderful. However, we did say that economics is a social science, and we find that workers don't behave quite in the way that we expect them to work, and we don't see that labor actually works in the way that we have in this model. In fact, we find workers are far less sensitive to FICA than employers are. Workers are basically inelastic when it comes to FICA, and employers are more elastic. And so if we really want to take a sort of a true model, we might want to look at more of a relative elasticity for demand compared to the demand that we have over here. In that case, we'd have a chart that would look more like this. Now, this chart may be one that reflects more like the cashier's chart. The first graph we see over here, I said this is sort of a macro view, all of the United States, but we also talked about the fact that we can't really put labor into one market. We have multiple markets. So the cashier's labor market may look very different than the engineer's labor market. That may look different than the college professor's labor markets. That may look different than the landscaper's labor market. So each one of those is going to have a slightly different look, and that would be microeconomics. But in this case, we have a much steeper curve, and so we have more elasticity to the demand in this case. As you've been looking at this, you'll notice that quantity is the same, but you may have noticed that the no tax wage is different. It's much higher on this one compared to that one. If I can draw a straight line with my little dot there, you can see that. So how does this play out? Well, here's the interesting thing. While that dot may be higher for no tax wage, the actual wage is not going to change much, meaning is that we're going to see that these 2 points are basically the same as far as, remember, we're talking about wages here. And if we do that, then we're going to basically see a bracket like this. And we're going to see the wages that workers receive versus the wages that they pay. Our tax revenues are now not equal. It's more of a 25-75%. And yet you're saying, but I told you that the firm pays 50% and you pay 50%. And that's true. You would still see that if you had a $200 FICA here, that they had paid $200. So why is it that you now have the burden of 75%? It's that you're not being paid the amount based on the no tax wage. Because if you were, then we would see a bracket like this, where we have 50-50. And remember over here, we have 50-50, and here's our bracket. Here's the 50-50, same bracket here. And if that was true, then what we would see is that the wages that you should receive would be higher than the wages you actually receive. So what we see in markets where there's basically a more elastic demand, the burden basically goes to the supplier, because they're not being paid this wage, they're being paid this wage. So it's a theoretical argument, but it's an argument you hear quite often out there on why wages should be increased or decreased because of tax burdens, of what they should be being paid versus demand versus what they're actually being paid. Because in this case, the worker is the producer and the employers are the buyers. And so the employers in the long run wind up paying less in a way because they pay you less for your wages. So it's an interesting argument that's out there, but another one that adds to the complexity of a lot of these arguments for different type of government policies. The biggest purpose of this lecture was for you to understand that the economy is governed by two kinds of laws. First, there's government policies and laws, and then there is the law of supply and demand. Now, with government policies and laws, we just started sort of scratching the surface. We looked at price control, binding and non-binding, and we looked at taxes and began to discover that the burden falls heaviest on the less elastic market. But it also was to show you that we need to look at the history of what occurs to understand what we need to do in the future. So we looked at the 1970 gas supply problems, and how we didn't repeat those problems when Hurricane Katrina and Rita came by. Another one that I didn't really talk about, didn't want to spend another slide on, was the luxury tax that Congress put in 1990. When they put that tax in, it turned out that that tax really became a burden on suppliers, not on the purchasers. And so by 1993, we had removed that tax. So as you progress in more knowledge of economics, this will help you make better decisions on understanding the policies that people are bringing forward to you that they want you to consider. We really got into the heart of economics, and I hope you enjoyed this. You might want to check out the companion videos. I did notice in the test banks there are quite a lot of math problems that go along with this, and I will walk you through some of those. Until next time, keep learning.